My question is to all the panelists, which is for them to perhaps have this, I offer them this opportunity to explain to us what they mean particularly about borders and boundaries, and how borders connect to notions of boundary and boundary objects, perhaps, if you're into that type of mode of analysis. But just if you could just elaborate what you mean by boundary and borders.
When I think about borders, as I said in the talk, borders of the state. Now these aren't sort of lines on the map in today's globalized world, because far-flung airports across the world can engage in sort of border control for various states. But there is also something very pertinent about land borders. And so you can think, for example, of the US-Mexico border and the sort of militarization of that border since the late 1980s. So that's one way I think about borders. I think about borders in relation to the nation state and citizenship, so the regulation of citizenship around who's allowed to enter and who's not, around who's granted citizenship and who's not. So that also came out in the talk. And a third thing that maybe was more implicit in my talk is that I also think of borders around disciplines. And so as a political scientist doing work on immigration for many years, I should note that this was not a mainstream topic area in political science until, really after the Cold War ended and more into the 2000s as immigration came to be viewed in relation to security concerns. So as a consequence, when I was doing work in this area, I read widely in other in relation to the findings of other disciplines that had historically looked more at issues around immigration, at issues around race and ethnicity and those sorts of things. So those are some of the ways that I think about borders.
In the context of paid work and family work, we're really talking about social borders, or borders between institutions, if you will, the institution of family and the institution of the workplace. For many years, it was assumed that those borders, those boundaries, should be firm, inflexible, and impermeable, that they were separate spheres and should be separate spheres and should not interfere with one another. I think where we are today is that those boundaries are at minimum very permeable, very porous. And I think we're moving to a point where those boundaries, those borders are almost non-existent, and in part facilitated by technology and globalization and those kinds of things. So many of us, certainly not everyone, but so many of us in the professions in particular, are working so much out of our homes, in our homes, and so on, that I think the borders are becoming very indistinct.
I don't normally talk about borders at all. The nearest equivalent for me would be organizational boundaries. And the thing I was interested in today was two things. First of all, inside organizations, the lack of borders between units within them. But more in particular, the lack of borders, boundaries, around organizations that are interacting. So it's borders. I don't think I've ever written a paper with borders in the paper at all. It's equivalent to me of organizational boundaries.
Stephen Harper said a couple of years ago that Canada is not a colonial country. Came as quite a shock to those of us who saw the British and French and Vikings come. When I talk about borders, I talk about them both in ways of benevolence, in that we have to embrace our own individuality and our own distinctness as different peoples. But I also think about them in multidimensional ways in terms of the forgetting culture of Canadian history. How people actually don't understand very much about this country, or even are able to distance themselves from the fundamental values. When I talk to Canadians, I talk to them about the national anthem, that line, "O Canada, we stand on guard for thee." But we really haven't taught kids in Canada how to critically think, or even how to stand on guard And we have done many of the things that you've raised in your presentation around creating this kind of moral mutinous, moral blindness culture, as Fred Baird would describe it. We've done that in Canadian society as well. And so we have a generation before us who has somehow accepted the fact that this is implicit and acceptable boundary that imposes a lack of opportunity on First Nations children in ways that would be garnered, and rightfully so, unacceptable for any other Canadian. And those are just, you know, I can go on for a while about this, but that's some initial thoughts anyway. Yes, go ahead.
I just, you know, want to sort of pick up on your talk to also just think about the fact that, I mean, we've been talking about Canada a lot here, but, you know, Indigenous people talk about Turtle Island, and they're thinking of all of North America, you know, Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And it's a reminder also that, you know, borders are socially constructed. They're constructed, you know, out of particular historical periods. And I think, you know, your comments are really important for reminding us of Canada's settler colonial history and legacy that continues.
Clearly, all of you want to help Canadians better understand the issues you're exploring. And I think even in this last question and answer, you've addressed a part of this, but what is the key barrier, if you had to identify just one barrier, to knowledge transfer around the border that you're studying? What is the key barrier to knowledge transfer around that? And how would you, maybe in a brief sentence, try to overcome that barrier?
I was trying to see if there was any solutions out of what you were saying. And some of the things that were sort of, you know, coming about were things like younger generation children, for instance, you know, corporations versus non-corporations, homes versus industry or workplace, and countries versus countries, or people versus countries. So I'm just thinking these are really, really broad problems. And if you were to come up with one solution or one idea that would incorporate your whole, you know, like concern, and if you had one idea on how to fix it, just a tiny little one, what would it be?
From our perspective in the institutional world, you're talking as though knowledge is something and it's just, we can't move it around. It's out there somehow, and that's just not the way we think about things. We would say that an institutional logic is a cognitive normative framework that you take for granted. So your talk is about a colonial person who had a certain interpretation of what was appropriate and right, and we've got to get these native Indians to adopt our way. He saw the world that way. So the biggest barrier to moving any kind of understanding is the dominant logic at play at that moment. And when I mentioned earlier that before 1980, we had much more of a stakeholder view of organizations. That's since been supplanted by a shareholder view of organizations. And that drives how organizations should think, how chief executive officers should behave. So the obstacle is the institutional logic that is embedded in you and in the organizations that you interact with. Now, what's the solution to the problem I'm looking at, which is this undermining of their due diligence? They wanted me to sign a piece of paper before I came saying that they could actually put this thing on the web, and I said, it depends what I say. I actually think the audit function should not be a private company operate, should not be in the hands of audit firms. The audit function should be in the hands in the same way as a judicial function is. It should be public. And if you say that to an accountant in this country or in the UK, they look at you as if you're absolutely stupid because they have this institutional logic in their head that is not open to that kind of consideration.
I would agree absolutely with your idea that really one of our biggest enemies is the social way that we constructed the country and our understanding of our reality and what we accept and don't challenge, and critical thinking. And your comment was really interesting because around what are the solutions. And I find when people dialogue about Aboriginal children, they often use the word complex to describe this. In fact, institutions will create Aboriginal liaison officers, almost like you need specially trained people to reach out to us because we're so complex that we beguile any kind of understanding of humanity. I look at something what I call the first domino solution, which isn't the problem if solved, that would solve all the plethora of manifestations of inequality. For example, the high suicide rates, the difficulties in housing, but it makes solving those problems possible. And that's why we have Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. We feel that these communities deserve an equitable chance to have levels of funding that put them in a position to act on evidence-based solutions. And one of those examples in a child welfare context around poverty, for example, is child welfare socially constructs itself is to think that poverty is something you refer to. You know it's a factor, but you don't deal with it. But the United States has done something interesting called the Family Unification Program. And they looked at the figures across the country and realized that housing inadequacy was contributing to 30% of the removals. And so it costs an average of $45,000 to put a child in foster care. That's assuming that child does not have special needs. The numbers can go much higher. So instead of putting out the $45,000 to put the child in foster care, they provided 14,000 and change vouchers to child welfare workers so that to remediate the housing concerns. And what did they find? For a $15 million investment, they were able to either reunite or keep out of child welfare care 7,500 kids. And they were able to save the taxpayer $131 million. Those are real on-the-ground solutions that we have not even had an opportunity to implement in Canada. And given the housing crises on reserve, I think something like that would have high potential for success and positive outcomes for kids.
I'm going to answer the first question about knowledge transfer and just say that I think one of the things that unites disciplines across the social sciences, but also the social sciences with the natural sciences, is that we tend to place an emphasis on evidence, and evidence-based research is really important. And so I think it's a trend that I find concerning would be when evidence-based research is devalued. And actually, there's a recent book that just came out called The War on Science, which is looking at the kind of muzzling of scientists in the field of the environment by that were working for the government, and it really draws attention to some of the problems when people who may be independently trained and using the tools of science and evidence-based research can't speak out. And I think also a concern I have in the contemporary period is, we have in the social sciences relied very heavily on census data. And the changes in 2011 with the removal of the long-form census, and now with the information now coming out from Statistics Canada, which has all kinds of provisos and so on, have implications for the work that we do. So I think that I think that would be a barrier to knowledge transfer, and also the ongoing quest for building knowledge as well. And then in terms of the question of one idea on how to fix it, I'm going to go back a little bit further in time and just say that, one of the significant changes in the post-World War II period was what some people call the human rights revolution. And so out of changes in that period, you get a new emphasis on the equality of all human beings. And I think that we're still living that human rights revolution, and within it, and the ideas that are contained with it, and how that's evolved from considering rights of women, or more recently in the United Nations, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Those are significant changes, and I think an area to focus on to sort of think about how you develop a real human rights culture and way of thinking about these amongst governments and also amongst people.
I would agree with Yasmin that the biggest barrier in the work that we do to try to inform policy around caregiver supports, and in particular trying to help caregivers balance their unpaid care work with their paid work. I think the biggest barrier we face with policymakers is a very recent almost rejection of scientific evidence in decision-making. And I don't know what the solution to that one is, to be honest. We persist working with the bureaucrats who do have a little more interest in what we have to say. And we will continue to work with them, and we take opportunities, given that we have the evidence in our back pockets, we take the opportunities where they present themselves to participate in the process. Given we have fairly long-standing relationships with many of our policy partners, those opportunities do come up from time to time, and we're ready for them. With employers, I think Royston's explanation, I think, is as good as any in terms of the institutional barriers. And with employers, I'm an economist, and I'm actually embarrassed to say this, but I actually play the money card with employers in trying to help them to understand that unless they're prepared for what's going on in the labor force now and what's likely to be going on in the labor force in the very near future as the population continues to age and families continue to change and formal supports continue to change, they're going to have a really serious problem on their hands, and they're going to be incurring a lot of costs if they don't do something to accommodate their caregiver employees. And so we're trying to turn the table, and rather than scare them away with, this is what it's costing you to have caregiver employees in the labor force, what we're trying to do is say, these are costs that you can save yourselves by implementing some relatively low or no cost solutions in your workplaces. So I'm admitting to playing to their weaknesses.
Because an institutionalist would say what you need to do to get those kind of reforms into the workplace is connect them to wider social logics. The example would be affirmative action for women in the States. When this first came in, it was not something that businesses were too keen on because they were dominated by the market logic. And so the personnel departments and the HR profession, which was beginning to develop, said, you know what this does is it gets the right person in the right job at the right time, and this is good for business. So it connected, it framed what they were trying to do in the logic of the individuals that had power.
Talking about citizenship got me thinking that in Arabic, there's this absence of the notion of citizenship and citizen. There is no equivalent of, there's no Arabic equivalent of the notion or of the word of citizen and citizenship, so it's really problematic. The closest cognate word I can think of is muwatan or muwatana, which is just Arabic for dwelling or dweller, which is rooted in allegiance and nationalism rather than the Western understanding of citizenship. So my question is, do you think that this linguistic vacuum or the absence of citizenship education in the Arab world or in the third world countries for that matter would hinder or help the line of moving from immigration to citizenship or the very experience of immigration at all? I'm from Iraq, and that's why I'm using the Arab community as my frame of reference.
I mean, it's an interesting question about words and, whether they resonate or have the same meaning in different languages. I would just say that discussions of citizenship have certainly been on the agenda in parts of the Arab-speaking world, and in the period, in the sort of post-Oslo period, even in the question of the occupied Palestinian territories, there were discussions of citizenship, and that's where you have a place where there's an absence of a state even, and an absence of where it's a people living under military occupation. So I think there are, examples you can point to where there's discussions of citizenship. And I think that, most of the findings from studies about when people move to immigrate to Canada show that, there's a period of transition, but when people acquire citizenship, they engage politically, they may vote. There may be variations between groups, but there's an interest in getting Canadian citizenship. And another interesting thing is that in the second generation, you see, second generation, so those born in Canada, but their parents are immigrants, you tend to see the most active of all generations in terms of political engagement. So I'm not sure there's evidence there to suggest that, that immigrants coming from diverse parts of the world, don't engage with Canadian citizenship if they acquire it.
If I could, I just want to circle back to your slide on surveillance. Some of you in the audience know I have a very personal relationship to that. We were talking also about the muzzling of scientists and the muzzling of academic voice. The government of Canada has been on my personal Facebook page. It's followed me all over the world as I do presentations. And the Privacy Commissioner has found that their actions were unlawful. Canada has been talking a lot about surveillance lately in the international sphere. And the minister responsible has gone on TV to say that it's illegal, of course. We wouldn't be doing this to Canadians because it's illegal. I think my case really shows that it is happening, irrespective of the illegality of it. And I went public with my case not so that other people and academics would be afraid, but rather to say that we need to expose these tactics when they are used against us. Because I know that it's happening to me because I have the evidence to prove it. I have the government documents to prove it. But I suspect it's happening to many others as well. And to the degree that we remain silent about it, those of us who have been affected or those of us who know people who have been affected, then we reinforce that culture where evidence becomes more distant from the public policy making in this country and affecting other countries abroad.
All right.